The last day of death row, inmate Geoffrey West, from cookie jar to death row. Hello friends, tonight we journey to Alabama, where a quiet gas station became the scene of a crime that would haunt an entire community for nearly 3 decades. In 1997, a young man named Geoffrey Todd West, once a familiar face behind the counter, returned not as an employee, but as an intruder with a deadly plan. What began as a desperate grab for cash quickly spiraled into something far darker, leaving behind shattered lives and unanswered questions that echo to this day. Now, after years of appeals and delays, West's final date with justice has been set, and his last hours on death row are approaching. How does a man who once refused to fight for his life face the reality of the end? Stay with us until the very end of this prison documentary. And don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more stories that reveal the truth behind death row. Geoffrey West was no stranger to trouble. Growing up in Atala, Alabama, he developed a reputation for drifting toward crime. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had already been arrested for robberies and spent time behind bars. Drugs controlled his every move. His addiction wasn't just a bad habit. It was the engine that drove his decisions, the constant hunger that pushed him deeper into desperation. By 1990, he had been released early on parole, but showed no signs of reform. Instead, he was plotting his next move. West once worked at Harold's Chevron, a modest gas station that stood like so many others along Alabama's quiet highways. He knew its layout well and remembered the peculiar detail that would later drive his plan behind the counter. Hidden from casual view sat a cookie jar that usually contained around $200 in small bills. It wasn't much money, but for a young man enslaved to drugs, it represented a night's fix and a way to keep the cravings away. West began telling friends he intended to rob the store, and this time he would leave no witnesses. On the night of March 27, 1997, his plan took shape. His girlfriend, Amy Pierce, agreed to drive him. She knew exactly what he intended to do, yet she climbed into the car anyway. West carried a .45 caliber handgun, heavy in his hand, as the pair headed toward Harold's Chevron. Inside the store, behind the counter that he once stood behind as an employee, was 33-year-old clerk Margaret Berry. She was a mother, a woman of faith, someone who had no idea that the ordinary night shift she was working would be her last. When West entered, he confronted Margaret with cold determination. He ordered her to lie face down on the floor, and she complied, terrified but obedient, hoping that doing as she was told might spare her life. West reached behind the counter, retrieved the cookie jar, and stuffed the cash into his pocket. But true to the grim words he had shared with friends, he was not about to leave a witness. With Margaret lying helpless before him, he raised the gun and fired a single shot into the back of her head. In an instant, her life was gone, and West turned to leave as if nothing more needed to be said. Amy Pierce was waiting outside. West climbed back into the car, and together they sped away into the Alabama night. But if West thought his crime would remain hidden, he underestimated both his community and his own carelessness. The investigation began quickly. Law enforcement immediately suspected the killer might have been someone familiar with the store. How else would they have known about the cookie jar? That suspicion was confirmed when whispers started to spread. West, never one to keep quiet, had bragged before the robbery that he would commit the crime, and afterward, he bragged again that he had done it. His arrogance and loose tongue betrayed him. Within 24 hours, the police had their suspect. West was arrested, and Amy Pierce was taken into custody as well. Facing the weight of the evidence, Amy struck a deal, pleading guilty and agreeing to testify against the man she once loved. She received a 35-year sentence, though she was later released early. Reports suggest she has lived quietly since, but the shadow of that night has never lifted. West, however, denied his role despite his earlier boasting. He faced trial in 1999, 2 years after the crime. The prosecution laid out the facts: his knowledge of the store, his confessions to friends, and Amy's testimony all pointed directly at him. The jury deliberated not only his guilt, but also his punishment. 10 of 12 jurors voted for death, sealing West's fate. What happened during the sentencing phase revealed something about his character. As his defense attorney began to argue for life without parole, presenting mitigating factors that might spare him, West pulled the lawyer back down into his seat. He demanded that no arguments be made on his behalf. His words were chilling in their simplicity if he could not be found innocent. He did not want to live the rest of his life behind bars. In that moment, it seemed as if he embraced death rather than face decades in a cell without the drugs that had once ruled him. The jury gave him what he asked for. But what West may not have considered was the slow march of time that lay ahead. Though sentenced to death in 1999, his appeals and the state's cautious process meant that his execution would not be scheduled until 27 long years later. The young man who once mocked the idea of a lifetime in prison would live nearly 3 decades confined within the walls of Alabama's death row. Meanwhile, the memory of Margaret Berry has not faded. Known in her community as Laney Margaret Parrish, she was a devoted mother of 2 boys, a loving wife to Rodney, and an active member of her church. She lived a quiet, faithful life, defined by her care for her children and her role in her family. For her loved ones, the horror of her final moments is balanced by memories of her kindness, her laughter, and her devotion. But nothing can erase the hole left behind. As the execution date approaches, the final hours of Geoffrey West take on a grim familiarity. The routine of death row follows a steady pattern. The condemned man is moved to a holding cell near the chamber. Guards keep close watch, while officials prepare for the last meal, the paperwork, the somber rituals that mark the end. For West, each hour brings him closer to the moment he once claimed to accept. Yet after so many years of appeals, it is impossible to know what thoughts run through his mind now. Does he still see death as preferable to life? Or does he look back on his wasted decades with regret? The chamber awaits him. The sterile walls, the heavy straps, the witnesses beyond the glass. Each detail is part of the final act. When the warden gives the signal, West will face the conclusion of the path he chose in 1997, when addiction and arrogance steered him toward the gas station that night. In the end, dear friends, the case of Geoffrey Todd West reminds us how a single choice, made in desperation and arrogance, can ripple through decades. What began as a plan to steal a handful of dollars cost a devoted mother her life, left 2 young boys without their parent, and shattered an entire community's sense of safety. Now, nearly 30 years later, West faces the reality of the execution chamber, the final chapter of a path he himself once claimed to accept. For the family of Margaret Berry, the sentence may bring a measure of closure, but it can never restore what was lost. As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that every decision carries weight, and that the cost of addiction and violence can be higher than anyone imagines. Thank you for watching this prison documentary, and don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more stories from death row.